Good afternoon. Welcome to BYJU'S exam prep. I apologize for the slight delay. 75 days to CAT 2023. What should be your reading comprehension prep strategy? That is what we'll be looking at today. Give me a heads up, give me a thumbs up if you can see me and hear me clearly so that we can start the session. All right. Are you ready to start, guys? Okay, now 75 days to go. We've been telling you right from the beginning that the most important part of any aptitude test preparation is a regular reading habit. Read at least half an hour a day. At least half an hour a day, which means you can read an editorial, an article, and maybe even half a short story. Or editorials of 4-5 newspapers. Hello, Sonali. All right, now that is your dal chawal. That is part of your daily routine, as regular as you brush your teeth and bathe, right? That is not preparation. That is building a hygiene habit in you. That is the skill that CAT is trying to test. Can you read? Can you understand what you're reading? So you have to go there and practice at the nets. That's what you're doing. You're reading at least half an hour a day. All right. After that, how much have I really absorbed from what I have reading? What skill have I developed? Take our sectional tests and our mock tests. This is a must. The next All India Open mock is on. I want each and every one of you who's attending this session, who finds this session even a little useful, I hope you found it more than a little useful, you take the mock test so that you see how you are able to answer not just one passage in a timed way that we've been doing in class, how you can do 4 passages on the trot. How you can do summary questions and para-jumble and para-summary questions with maximum accuracy. So for that, to take the open tests, open mocks, you have to first prepare your strategy and timing by taking sectional and mock tests, right? Sectional test will be only VARC section. Give 40 minutes. It's just like the VARC section of CAT, maybe a little easier. We have different degrees of difficulties. Take that. Mock test exactly patterned on CAT, where you take all 3, quant, LRDI and VARC, which requires a lot more. Your brain, it requires a lot more stamina for your brain to really solve all those problems and yet not lose concentration. Now, just taking the mock is not enough. We keep telling you, watch the analysis sessions, watch our experts attempt the mock, and then you say, oh, Gautam sir did it like this, how come I did it in a different way? Maybe that's why he is getting it right, that's why I got it wrong. Srinivas is taking it like this, maybe it will work for me next time. Now, when you watch the analysis, analyze your own attempt vis-a-vis the attempt made by our experts and our mentors and see, will their strategy work better for you or your strategy work better for you? Not always that somebody else's strategy works for you. Whatever works for you is best. In BYJU'S itself, my colleagues and I differ on CAT strategy. I finish all the RCs first. I do not say I'll do the hardest RC last. If the first RC that I see is tough, I don't leave it, because I have found if I leave it, I don't have time to attempt even 2 out of the 4 questions. So my strength is reading comprehension. I finish all the reading comprehension questions first, whatever I can attempt. In the toughest RC, if I can read and answer at least 2 out of 4 questions, I do it. And I know that the other 2 questions, only if I have the time, I'll go back to it. 99% of the time, I won't have the time to go back and do a review of those questions. So analyze your mock attempts and then get your doubts cleared by your mentors. That's very important. Why is it B? I am convinced C is the right answer. Try to tell me why B is the right answer. The mentor can explain to you so that you don't make the same mistake again. this should be your routine if you follow, if your strategy is similar to mine. Somebody else may tell something different, but nobody will have any differences with this. Mocks are an important, analysis of the mocks are important, and a daily reading habit is important. Alright, let's start with the first passage. As usual, I'm going to show it to you for 40 seconds, 35 to 40 seconds. Please read it quickly and then we'll move on to the next slide. Your time starts now. I've chosen a past year CAT question. Don't pause to know the meaning of any word. If there is any word you don't understand, remember it, look up the dictionary later. Remember the sentence and look up the dictionary later. Right? Alright. Next. Okay. Next slide. All right. Next, I'll summarize it for you. And please excuse my hoarse voice. All right. So when you first read the passage, the first thing that struck you is the language. Not very easy. Second, the subject, also tough, right? Colonial concerns, Orientalism, interpretations of Indian past, not the easiest of subjects. So what do you need to do? When you look at a passage like this, you know what to anticipate. When you're going uphill, you know what to anticipate. So let's quickly summarize the passage before we look at the questions. The first reading that you do of the passage is important. You should not rush through it. At the same time, you should not take your own sweet time. Otherwise, you'd be left spending 15 minutes on a passage and not have time to complete the rest of the paper. So let's quickly read it, summarize it. Interpretations of the Indian past were influenced by colonial concerns and interests and prevalent European ideas about history, civilization, and the Orient. So when you talk of interpretations of the Indian past, they were influenced by European ideas about history, about civilization, about Orient means the East, which includes India. Orientalist scholars studied the languages and texts with selected Indian scholars, but made little attempt to understand the worldview of those who were teaching them. So the scholars who were interested in Oriental language, whatever, texts, they studied languages and texts with certain Indian scholars. So it was a joint collaboration. But what is the part they neglected? They did not try to understand the perceptions, the worldviews of the people who were teaching them these things, of Indian scholars. The readings, therefore, are something of a disjuncture of a traditional way of looking at the Indian past. Therefore, their readings of Indian culture were different. They were looking at it from their view, not from the traditional view of looking at the Indian past. Orientalism, which we understand broadly as Western perceptions of the Orient. Orientalism, study of the Orient, can actually be, in other words, described as Western perceptions of the Orient. And what were they fueled by? What gave them the push? Fantasy and freedom. The European Romanticism sought fantasy and freedom, and this Orientalism provided that fantasy and freedom that the Europeans sought, especially in their opposition of neoclassicism. So basically, Orientalism can be described as Western perceptions of the Orient, and these were highly influenced by the fantasy and freedom sought by European Romanticism. What is European Romanticism? I don't know. It is not given in the passage, therefore we are not going to look into it. Right? Because in the exam we only know what is the term given to us. Our earlier understanding of the term is not important. Here he has described what is Orientalism. That's enough for me. I don't want to waste my time. You shouldn't be wasting your time understanding any other term, or forcing yourself to understand, or wasting your time to understand any other term. Get the broad picture of the first slide? Yes? Move to the next one. The cultures of Asia were seen as bringing in a new romantic paradigm. This was a framework, a different romantic framework altogether. Another renaissance was anticipated through an acquaintance with the Orient. The rebirth of culture, art, literature. Many people thought with this fascination for the Orient, there would be another renaissance, which would be different from the Greek Renaissance. It was believed that this Oriental Renaissance would liberate European thought and literature from the increasing focus on discipline and rationality. So European thought and literature was dominated at that time by discipline and rationality. Those who were trying to understand the cultures of Asia were trying to escape this rigid discipline and rationality, and were hoping that the study of the Orient of Asian cultures would give them that escape. The Romantic English poets Wordsworth and Coleridge were apprehensive of the changes introduced by industrialization and turned to nature and the fantasies of the Orient. Because they wanted to escape this discipline and rationality, they turned to the East. Got it? However, this enthusiasm greatly changed to conform with the emphasis later on the innate superiority of European civilization. How did it start and how did it end? They were hoping to get away from the discipline, the rigidity, the rationality of the earlier Enlightenment. However, it changed, and the emphasis later became that European civilization is superior to Oriental civilizations. Oriental civilizations were now seen as having been once great, kabhi hota tha, once great but currently in decline. The various phases of Orientalism tend to mold European understanding of the Indian past into a particular pattern. Now, the various phases of Orientalism, they thought of the Orient as a civilization in decline, and the various phases of Orientalism, they had an idea, and they tend to put India in that straitjacket. They tend to European understanding of India and Indian past was forced into that particular pattern. There was an attempt to formulate Indian culture, and when doing this, they attempted to formulate Indian culture as uniform. Okay, they did not look at the disparities, the divergence, the diversity in Indian culture. They thought of Indian culture as something uniform. And what else happened? Such formulations being derived from texts. So all their understanding of Indian past and Indian culture were from texts, books, and so they thought, this is it, this is Indian culture. Next paragraph done. Next. The so-called discovery of India, they discovered India. He's calling it so-called because they've not discovered the actual India. They had a wrong perception. The so-called discovery of India was largely through selected literature in Sanskrit. Their understanding of India was through selected literature in Sanskrit. So they had access to selected literature in Sanskrit. They interpreted India's past and Indian culture through that selected literature in Sanskrit. This interpretation tended to emphasize non-historical aspects of Indian culture, unchanging continuity of society over 3,000 years, and it was believed that Indian pattern of life was so concerned with metaphysics, going beyond the physical, and the subtleties of religion belief, that little attention was given to the more tangible aspects. They thought of Indian culture as being totally spiritual. They thought of Indian culture having only metaphysical aspects, and they tended to neglect the more tangible physical aspects of the culture. German Romanticism endorsed this image of India, and it became the mystic land for many Europeans, where even the most ordinary actions were imbued with the complex symbolism. This was the genesis, the birth of the spiritual East, and also incidentally the refuge of European intellectuals seeking to distance themselves from the changing patterns of their own society. So if they thought of India, India became the mystic land. They tended to think of India as the land of spirituality and spiritualism. It also became the refuge, the source of solace, the place where they took protection, the European intellectuals. They were trying to distance themselves from the patterns of their own society, so they ran away to India. All right? A dichotomy in values was maintained. There was a dichotomy, a break. What was it? Indian values were spiritual, European values were materialistic. There was no attempt to juxtapose these values with the reality of Indian society. Was Indian society really only spiritual, European society totally material? There was no attempt to see the real Indian society and the so-called spirituality of the Indian society. India was seen as spiritual, Europe was seen as materialistic. This theme has been even more firmly endorsed by a section of Indian opinion in the last 100 years. Even Indians have tended to do this. It was a consolation to the Indian intelligentsia for its perceived inability to counter the technical superiority of the West. Now, even India started saying we are spiritual, they are materialistic, we are spiritually superior. And this emphasis on the spirituality of India was some consolation for the Indian intelligentsia. Why? Because they knew that they could not counter the technical superiority of the West, the perceived technical superiority. At least this gave them some solace. Okay, we may not be technically as superior, they may be technically superior to us, but we are spiritually superior to them. A superiority viewed as having enabled Europe to colonize Asia and other parts of the world. So even though we were spiritually superior, they were technically superior, which is why they could colonize us. At the height of the anti-colonial nationalism, it acted as a salve, as an ointment, as a balm, as something that would calm you down or cure you from having been a colony of Britain. It must have hurt being a colony of the Britain. So how did we appease ourselves? By saying we are spiritually superior, and this acted as a balm at the height of anti-colonial nationalism. Tough passage, we've now broken it down. This in the exam you will read in 5 minutes, 3 minutes, maximum 5 minutes. From this, let's answer the questions. Exact CAT questions, let's look at it. It can be inferred from the passage that to gain a more accurate view of a nation's history and culture, scholars should do all of the following except. Where does this question come from? Remember, in the first passage, the author says that the way the Orientalists, the European scholars who were studying the Oriental culture, what was the mistake they made? Right? The author has criticized them. So let's quickly go back to the first paragraph. What did they do? They studied the languages and texts with selected Indian scholars, but made little attempt to understand the worldview of those who are teaching them. So if, according to the author, if they had understood the worldview of those who were teaching them, they would have a better understanding of the culture. Then, therefore, there's something of a disjuncture from the traditional way of looking at the Indian past. Then, if they had done it like that, then they would have looked at Indian past from a better perspective, right? Okay, now, what are the things that he talked about? To examine the complex reality of that nature society. Now, because they only studied some, in the next paragraph he says, their exposure to India was only on the basis of the texts. They did not even try to look at the reality depicted. They didn't even try to understand Indian society. So, to understand, to get a more accurate view of the nation's history and culture, they should examine the complex reality of the nation's society. They should read widely the country's literature, not only the specific literature in Sanskrit that they read, this few books that they read, and they interpreted the entire country on that basis. And remember, they had their own beliefs and biases. He says later it changed into thinking of the European civilization as superior. So they had their own beliefs and biases. But why would the author encourage developing an oppositional framework to grasp cultural differences? Why would he develop an opposition? He is trying to understand Indian culture. Why would they try to develop an oppositional framework? That is irrelevant. Therefore, the correct answer is A, which Virendra answered. Very good. Next one. The author is not likely to support which view? Let's get your answers and then I'll take you back to the passage. You read the passage. The Orientalist view of Asia fired the imagination of some Western poets. They were fascinated by a Orientalist view of Asia, true or false, then can that be inferred? Indian culture acknowledges the material aspects of life. Indian culture has evolved over the centuries. India became a colony although it matched the technical knowledge of the West. Which one is the author not likely to support? So he will support 3 of the options. The correct answer is the option that he will not support. Which one is it? A, B, C or D? D. Virendra says D. Nidhi says D. Waiting for the others to answer. It fired the imagination of some Western poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge. He says they talked of Indian culture as spiritual and Western as material without juxtaposing it with Indian society. So the author would agree that Indian culture does acknowledge the material aspects of life. So 2 is there. It has evolved over the centuries. We know it's a ancient culture, and he's written about that. India became a colony. Indians believe despite their spiritual superiority, Because they lacked the technical knowledge, it became a colony. So it did not have the technical knowledge. So this contradicts what the author is saying. Right? Alright, this was a question which most students who took the test in, was this the second slot? I think it was taken from the second slot. I don't remember. First or second slot. When we were analyzing it, most students asked, how is this the particular answer? So let's see if you can get it right. Which one of the following styles of research is most similar to the Orientalist scholars' method of understanding Indian history and culture? You need to know the main point. What was the way the Orientalist scholars tried to understand Indian culture? Right? Then you will know which one would match it. Let's quickly go through the options. I'll take you back to the passage. Reading about early American settlers and later waves of migration to understand the evolution of American culture. Reading 18th century accounts by travelers to India to see how they viewed Indian life and culture at that time. Studying artifacts excavated at a palace to understand the lifestyle of those who lived there. Or analyzing Hollywood action movies that depict violence and sex to understand contemporary American society. First thing, do you think the author agrees with the Orientalist scholars' method of understanding Indian history and culture? Do you think he believes they did the correct thing? Question 1. Yes or no? No. So, when you want, I'm just telling you, without even going back to the passage. First option, when you want to know the life of early American citizens and later wave of migration, you would obviously read about it, right? So there's nothing wrong with this. You read all books on it, not just one author or one time. But reading about the early life of settlers, waves of migration, would give you an understanding. Reading 18th century accounts. Okay, only one 18th century accounts, but he says by travelers. So when travelers are going through India, they write their reflections. That will give us an understanding of how they viewed Indian life and culture at the time. This is also, if I want to know your perspective, you are coming to my city. Alright? If I want to know your perspective, your view about my city, I would go through what notes you have made. And 18th century accounts of travelers, of their perceptions at that time, this also seems to be okay. What's wrong with it? Correct? Now, there are two more. Studying artifacts excavated at a palace to understand the lifestyle of those who studied there. Let's assume there are some artifacts. So you are reading it, you are watching it, you are seeing it. Oh, there were cups, there were wine goblets, there were statues of dancing people. They were maybe interested in culture, they were maybe interested in art and dance. Analyzing Hollywood action movies that depict violence and sex to understand contemporary America. Now, C or D? Let's go back. Your answer seems to be C. Let me just go back. Two things, two paragraphs, two lines are really important here. One, they thought of European civilization to be superior. Okay. The various phases of Orientalism, what were they influenced by? The various phases of Orientalism tend to mold European understanding of the Indian past into a particular pattern. They didn't think of India as India, but they kind of tried to fit India into the Orientalist mode. That was one drawback. Second, there was an attempt to formulate Indian culture as uniform because they only read a text and tried to understand Indian culture from that text. Okay, you are reading a book and you are trying to understand Indian culture through what has been written in that book. Do you think that book really represents Indian culture? Isn't it a narrow, very narrow way of looking at Indian culture? It's only 1% perspective of that culture. The so-called discovery of India was through selected literature in Sanskrit. So what did they do? They had only a few books. Based on that, they said they had discovered India. So they did not look at the historical aspect of Indian culture. They only looked at Indian culture as it was depicted in a few Sanskrit texts. Isn't that closest to trying to understand the culture of America through Hollywood movies? Do you think Hollywood movies really depict American culture? Sanskrit text, selected Sanskrit text to interpret Indian culture is what the Orientalists did. Isn't that exactly analogous to D, which is looking at a movie and trying to understand or interpret a culture? So D is the correct answer. Got it? That's exactly analogous to that. Most of the students got it wrong. Okay? Either you didn't attempt it or you got it wrong. Alright, in the context of the passage, all of the following statements are true except. If you remember the summary, you don't have to go back to the passage for this, but let's quickly see. Orientalist scholarship influenced Indians. Indian texts influenced Orientalist scholars. India's spiritualism served as a salve for European colonizers. Orientalist understanding of Indian history was linked to colonial concerns. Which do you think is not correct or not given in the passage? Not correct either contradicts the passage or is out of scope of the passage. Correct? So which ones roughly do you think you can infer or remember given in the passage? And which ones are not? A, B, C or D. How did the Oriental scholars learn about Indian history, India's past? Through their interaction with Indian scholars, right? So Orientalist scholarship influenced Indian text and through selected Indian text. So ye to theek hai. Oriental scholarship influenced Indians, it did, right? They said this view shaped Indian thought for a long time. Which view? Those of you who marked a Nidhi, let me go back. One of the Oriental scholarship's interpretation. This theme, Orientalist scholarships, people who studied, gave a view of India, and this theme was even more endorsed by a section of Indians. Also here, all right. This line. So even Indian views were influenced by Orientalist scholars, which is why Indian intelligentsia thought of its spiritualism, which acted as a consolation. So A is also correct. Orientalist understanding of Indian history was linked to colonial concerns, first paragraph. Now, in what context has the salve been written? The ointment, the balm, something that gave some sort of consolation. India's so-called spiritual superiority gave Indian nationalists some salve. That okay, we may not be technically as good as those people, so we don't know whether Indian spiritualism served as a salve for European colonizers. The romanticism that was India and India's spiritualism gave Orientalist scholars, European romanticists, some others, it gave them some, they ran away from their own material concerns and came to us. But not necessarily European colonizers. Alright, and whether that gave us a salve, they thought of Indian spiritualism, but did that really give them any help? C has not been mentioned. Maybe, but hasn't been mentioned. Okay? Alright. We Do we have time for one more passage? We'll do this really, really quickly. All right, I'll read it for you. The Chinese have two concepts of a copy. The fanshipin are imitations where the difference from the original is obvious. Because Orient means the East. So people who were interested in the East were Orientalists. Orientalism is fascination for the East. For the Westerners, China, India, we are all in the East. For us, they are Occidental cultures, the Western cultures. Alright? So, these are small models or copies that can be purchased in a museum. So, when you have an art piece, the Chinese, they make imitations of the original arts, which are smaller models, which are copies, which you can purchase in the museum. This is one. The other is the Fujipin. The Fujipin are exact reproductions of the original, and to the Chinese, they are of equal value to the originals. जो भी बना रहे हो हुसैन का horses, you make it on your own, exactly like Hussein. Art does not give value to it if it's a copy, right? But for the Chinese, if it's a copy, looks exactly like the original, its value is the same as an original. This discrepancy with regard to understanding what a copy is has often led to misunderstandings between Chinese and Western museums. So when China sends a copy, Western museums say we won't keep it, we want the original. The Chinese are hurt and angry, saying the same value. The Far Eastern notion of identity is also very confusing to the Western observer. First is the idea of copy having the same value as the original. Second is the notion of identity. In Japan, there is a famous, the Ice Grand Shrine in Japan, which is rebuilt from scrap every 20 years. And the Japanese people revere that temple. It's 1300 years old. Millions of Japanese visit it, but to them, the temple is rebuilt every 20 years. They don't care. For them, it has the same value, the same sacredness as the 13-year-old material that was used. The Cathedral of Freiburg Minster in southwest Germany is covered in scaffolding. This is the east, this is the west. So in Germany, you have a cathedral which always has scaffolding because it is in danger of falling. So there's protection outside. The material that was used is vulnerable to erosion, rain and wind, and it keeps crumbling. So as a result, the cathedral is continually being examined for damage, and continually, whatever is getting damaged, they keep building that part. Okay? Attempts are made to preserve the stones from the Middle Age, but at some point, they replace it with new materials. Fundamentally, that's the same thing as the Japanese, except that in the cathedral in Germany, this process of changing doesn't take once in 20 years, Sara temple ko nikal ke bana diya. They don't do it. In Germany, as each piece falls, they keep rebuilding bits and pieces. In the field of art as well, the idea of unassailable original developed historically in the West. Somebody makes an original, that is the original, you can't make a copy. This unassailability, fixed nature of the original developed in the West. Alright, Western excavated, but back in the 17th century, excavated artworks from antiquity were treated differently. This concept of unassailable original developed only newly. In the 17th century, it was not like that. When they excavated art pieces, they were not restored in a way that was faithful. They just did what they want, changing their appearance. This intellectual position that explains why Asians have far fewer scruples about cloning than Europeans. We don't think too much about cloning and copying. The South Korean Asian perspective. The South Korean cloning researcher Fong Woo-suk, who attracted worldwide attention for cloning experiments, is a Buddhist. And he said there is nothing unethical with cloning because Buddhism believes in recycling through reincarnation. Okay? Alright. Quickly. Which one of the copies would a Chinese museum be unlikely to consider less value than the original? Which one of these would the Chinese accept as having the same value as the original? Quickly. Pablo Picasso's painting of Vincent van Gogh's original painting identical in every respect. Picasso's photograph of Van Gogh's original picture printed exactly the same scale. His miniaturized version of Van Gogh's original painting, or his painting of the original painting bearing his signature, which shows that it is his. Alright, which one do you think the Chinese would regard as having the same value as the original? A, B, C or D? Quickly give me your answer. Nidhi, why B? Did the passage say anything about photographs have the same value as the original painting? Virendra says A. Remember, what was the key there? It should look exactly like the original. It should be a proper copy of the original. Photograph, no. Miniature version, no. And the signature is not an exact copy. Therefore, the answer is A. Next one. What is the similarity? Which one does not represent the similarity between the Grand Shrine and the cathedral? Both replacements are being made, right? Both can be regarded as very old, which is not similar. So we'll throw out the similarities and look at the dissimilarities. Both can be regarded as very old structures. Oh, that definitely. Both will one day be completely rebuilt. One is anyway being rebuilt every 20 years, another slowly but surely. Both were built as places of worship, yes. They will be completely rebuilt. No, Nidhi, he says that every part is crumbling. As each part is crumbling, they are putting new. So eventually a time will come. Just think of it. Extend your logic, right? But both are not continually undergoing restoration. Only the cathedral in Germany is undergoing restoration. The Japanese shrine, every 2 years they scrap it and build a new one anyway. Got it? So the answer is D. Which of the following scenarios is unlikely to follow from the arguments, which not in line with the arguments in the passage? A 17th century British painter would have no problem adding personal touches when restoring an ancient Roman painting. 17th century. A sentence has been mentioned about 17th century restoration. So think of that and see if A goes with that. A 20th century Japanese Buddhist monk would value a reconstructed shrine as the original. Think of the statement on the Grand Shrine. A 17th century French artist who adhered to a Christian worldview would need to be completely true to the original intent of a painting when restoring it. A 21st century Christian scientist is likely to oppose cloning because of his philosophical orientation. Is it C or D? 7. British 17th century, they did the interventions any which way they liked, so they would have no problem changing. We know one is clearly given. Buddhist monk, like in Grand Shrine now, they think of it as new, though every 20 years. So is it C or is it D? 17th century French artist adhering to a Christian worldview needs to be completely true to the original intent of the painting when restoring it. That is the answer, because in the 17th century they did not have such problems. Understood? Here cloning they don't really it is considered unethical. Okay, last question. Which of the value that modern West assigns to an unassailable origin has resulted in all except? discourages them from making interventions in ancient art because they don't want to damage the original. Does it discourage them from making interventions in ancient art? Discourages them from carrying out human cloning, discouraging them from simultaneous displays. Extend your logic, apply what they believe in. They believe in the value of the original. They don't want to tamper with the original. For them, the original has ultimate value. You copying is wrong. Okay? The most common wrong answer is D. Okay, now why do I, Prasanna, why am I calling it a most common wrong answer? Because if, think of the cathedral in Germany, continuously they're working on just keeping the original intact. So it does allow regular employment for certain craftsmen. It discourages because copies, original is original, they would not display copies. Now, they are against human cloning. It goes against their religious belief. They consider it unethical. But we do not know whether they really carry it out or not. They've told about, look at, if you really look at it, this was a very tricky question, and unless you're careful. The Asians have fewer scruples about cloning than Europeans. Europeans clone, they think of ethical things. It is not considered unethical in Asian cultures. Okay, so they have fewer qualms about it. Doesn't mean the Europeans do not do any cloning. Okay, some of them may go against it, but it doesn't go against. They may consider it unethical. Doesn't mean they don't carry it out. It doesn't say they do not. It says they have fewer scruples. Asians have fewer scruples about cloning than Europeans. That doesn't mean Europeans don't do cloning. Got it? That is how close CAT passages are. So even when I give my own passages, I always think regularly working through the CAT passages is your best preparation, even if you've done the passages before. Alright, so what's that key takeaway? Read. Solve RCs. Please enjoy the experience. Don't take it as, yaar, RC karna hai. Time yourself, challenge yourself, and do it at a time when you're most relaxed. Don't do it when you're tired. You come back from work, you're sitting there, you try to solve an RC passage. Won't work out. Alright? Okay. I will see you all again very soon in another session. Until then, remember, if you're joining our course, please unlock your free trial. Courses are on. We want to see you in our toppers batch. All India Open Mocks 29th to 8th October. I want each and every one of you to take the test. Alright? You will get better. You will at least have a 10-point advantage in CAT if you take all the open mocks and analyze it. Alright? I will see you very soon. Until then, bye-bye. Take care. Bye.